William Dampier, a farmer, his son born in 1652, was a man who couldn't stay put. Escaping the dreary rural life, he became a sailor, then a buccaneer, and eventually a captain who completed 3 circumnavigations of the globe. He did the unthinkable. He plundered ships. Yet with obsessive persistence, he explored uncharted lands, meticulously charted maps, described flora and fauna, and recorded every storm and current. His detailed diaries became a literary sensation, transforming Dampier into one of the most widely read authors of his era. Consequently, straits and islands were named after him, and his works laid the foundation for cartography and biology. This is where it gets interesting. For decades, we've been fed the image of a noble explorer who, by a mere twist of fate, found himself among corsairs. This is a lie. William Dampier was not just a pirate, but one of the most ruthless and calculating cutthroats who used science merely as a facade for his grand plundering schemes. His ruthlessness and cold calculation had deep roots, tracing back to the harsh English provinces of the 17th century. William Dampier was born into a world where fate was predetermined, and hunger and deprivation were commonplace. Farm life offered no room for ambition, only endless, grueling labor and a life of destitution. But unlike most of his peers, Dampier did not resign himself to this fate. He was not just restless, he was a solitary boy who experienced the bitterness of loss early. At 12, he lost his mother, and soon after, his father. This double tragedy at such a young age did not break him, but hardened him, forging a ruthless pragmatist. The world showed him its merciless, indifferent side too early, teaching him to rely only on himself and to take what he wanted at any cost. At 16, having escaped the suffocating rural backwater, he plunged into the embrace of the sea. This was not a romantic impulse, but a conscious choice for survival, a desperate bid to break free from a predetermined existence of stagnation. His first voyages on merchant ships, then on whalers in Newfoundland, became his brutal yet effective university. Here, politeness or morality were not taught. Here, one learned to survive storms, endure inhuman hardships, and view every person either as a potential threat or a tool to achieve a goal. He absorbed knowledge of winds, currents, and navigation, everything that could give him an advantage in this predatory world. But most importantly, he learned the lesson of cruelty and indifference to others, pain. He saw people fighting for scraps, how they were broken by the system, and he understood, to avoid being broken, one must not fight the system, but become a part of it, on one's own ruthless terms. The true point of no return came when Dampier found himself in the West Indies. This was not merely a region, it was a boiling cauldron of anarchy, where law was an empty word, and power belonged to those who possessed weapons and were not afraid to use them. Jamaica, the heart of the pirate world, became his new home and definitively shaped his worldview. Here, among the dregs of society, runaway slaves, deserters, ruined planters, the most desperate adventurers, he saw his true path. He could have chosen the life of an honest merchant or a hired laborer, as many others did. But Dampier, having already tasted freedom and the thrill of power over his own destiny, refused to settle for less. He witnessed how quickly corsairs amassed fortunes, how they lived by their own wild laws, submitting neither to king nor church. And he made his choice, a cold, calculated decision without a shadow of a doubt. He was not cornered, he was not forced by circumstances. He chose piracy as the most effective tool to achieve his goals, wealth, independence, and paradoxically, the opportunity to explore the world on his own terms. This was not a leap of faith into the unknown, but a clear strategic calculation. He consciously stepped into the abyss because he saw in it not a fall, but a springboard to unlimited opportunities. It was this abyss, turbulent and uncontrolled, that became the ideal environment for his ambitions. The 17th century was drawing to a close, leaving behind not only a trail of great geographical discoveries, but also the chaos born of the unceasing struggle between empires. Spain, France, England, Holland, all of them divided the world. Oceans not by maps, but by the power of their cannons. The West Indies, with its untold riches, became an arena of endless clashes. Law in these waters was little more than a recommendation, and the line between a privateer, acting under royal license, and an outright pirate blurred with every cannon shot. Powerful trading companies, such as the East India or West India companies, were merely the tip of the iceberg in an ocean of rapidly developing economic relations, where private enterprises and audacious ventures often yielded far greater dividends than state service. Colonies drained gold, silver, sugar, and tobacco. Streams of immense wealth flowed to the metropolises, making trade routes a tempting target for anyone with sufficient audacity and weaponry. But beyond the official trading companies, there existed a vast shadow market, where not only plundered treasures were valued, but also information about new lands, about flora and fauna, about routes and currents, about potential resources. In Europe, among the lower classes, poverty and hopelessness reigned. The sea beckoned as a path to freedom and enrichment, and tales of overseas adventures, however exaggerated, became the sole source of hope and inspiration. The public, hungry for exoticism, bought any printed material describing distant lands. Travel was not just entertainment, but an object of true cult. Royal societies and academies encouraged exploration, seeing in it not only scientific value, but also a tool for expanding influence and territorial claims. In this world, where information about distant lands was worth no less than gold, and scientific discoveries promised fame and influence, anyone who could offer both found fertile ground for the boldest and most cynical undertakings. Dampier wasted no time. Once he established himself in the pirate circles of the West Indies, his actions began to differ from typical bandit raids. He joined a group of buccaneers who specialized in plundering Spanish ships and settlements. But unlike his companions, for whom every raid was merely a means of profit, William transformed each sortie into a meticulously planned reconnaissance operation. He didn't just participate in battles, he recorded coordinates, drew detailed maps of coastlines, noted depths, currents, and winds. While others divided the spoils, he sketched unknown species of plants and animals, described the customs of indigenous peoples, and made meteorological observations. This was his first, grandly cynical scheme to use pirate expeditions as a cover for gathering invaluable geographical and scientific information. In 1686, Dampier joined Captain Leonard Swan, who was leading an expedition into the Pacific Ocean. For most, this was another daring pirate raid for Spanish gold, but for Dampier, an opportunity to cross the ocean and explore completely uncharted lands. Aboard the ship, where every day was a struggle for survival or a hunt for a new victim, he continued his painstaking work. His diaries were filled not only with descriptions of raids and the division of spoils, but also with precise navigational data, ethnographic notes on Pacific islands, and detailed sketches of the flora and fauna of New Holland, the future Australia. He was a predator who simultaneously acted as a naturalist, cartographer, and anthropologist. His scientific pursuits were inseparable from his pirate raids, and each new map or description of an unknown species only increased his value as a specialist in the eyes of both corsairs and potential patrons in Europe. He didn't just collect data, he systematized it, seeing it not merely as curious facts, but as a strategic resource. When his manuscript, later titled A New Voyage Round the World, was published in London in 1697, it caused a sensation. It was not merely an adventure report, but a detailed, scientifically verified description of unknown lands. Dampier masterfully presented himself as a brave explorer, only by chance finding himself among buccaneers, forced to engage in plundering for survival. He carefully edited his diaries, removing the bloodiest details and highlighting the scientific value of his observations. The public, hungry for exoticism, and the scientific community, eager for new discoveries, devoured the book with unprecedented enthusiasm. The British Admiralty, despite his dubious past, saw in him not a pirate, but a valuable expert on Pacific navigation and cartography. This publication became his most brilliant scam. It not only legalized his name, but also transformed him into a respected author and, most importantly, opened doors to new, now official expeditions that he could use for his further, now state-sanctioned, plundering. William Dampier immediately embarked on his next, most sophisticated phase of ascent. He didn't just publish a book, he created an image that expertly exploited the deepest desires and weaknesses of European society. He understood that navigational charts and descriptions of exotic plants were valued no less than gold, and sometimes even more. His personal toolkit had been honed by years of surviving the most brutal conditions. He possessed not the classic charisma of a charming gentleman, but a far more dangerous quality: the ability to inspire trust and the anticipation of grand discoveries, playing on the greed and curiosity of the powerful. He didn't just talk about distant lands, he sold a vision. To the Admiralty, he promised new trade routes and potential colonies, hidden beyond the horizon, teeming with untold riches. To the Royal Society, he offered unique biological specimens and previously unseen natural phenomena that could bring glory to his patrons. Dampier was not just a pirate who became a writer, he became the first proto-travel blogger in history who understood how to monetize adventures. He didn't just keep diaries, he carefully selected and packaged information, knowing precisely what would interest his audience. His sketches and maps were not just scientific data, but visual confirmation of his incredible tales, enhancing their value in the eyes of the public and sponsors. Dampier skillfully employed the tactic of expert selection, or rather, he positioned himself as the sole and undeniable expert on the Pacific, as no one else possessed such extensive personal experience. He cleverly created a buzz around his discoveries, releasing information in measured doses, fueling interest in his future expeditions. He was not shy about self-promotion, but he did it so subtly that his audacity was perceived as confidence. His personal adaptability was phenomenal. He could be a ruthless commander to his cutthroats, a meticulous naturalist to scholarly gentlemen, and a persuasive petitioner to officials. He changed masks with ease, always remaining loyal to only one goal: his own enrichment and the expansion of his opportunities. He transformed his pirate experience, which for anyone else would have been a death sentence, into a unique competitive advantage. He was the one who knew, not just read books. This privilege of being a man of experience in an era when information was worth its weight in gold made him indispensable. He didn't just survive, he thrived, because he understood that in a world where reputation is built on achievement, not morality, the key is knowing how to sell your story. And William Dampier sold it brilliantly. Having sold his story, Dampier quickly found buyers among Britain's most influential circles. The British Admiralty, always eager for new trade routes and colonies, recognized his knowledge of the Pacific Ocean as a strategic resource. They overlooked his pirate past, as no one else possessed such detailed maps and understanding of the winds and currents of uncharted waters. For them, William Dampier became an ideal instrument in the struggle for global dominance. Simultaneously, the Royal Society, the bastion of British science, embraced his works with no less enthusiasm. Scholars, keen to expand their collections, were captivated by his descriptions of unseen flora and fauna and ethnographic notes about distant peoples. Dampier gave them what they so craved: exoticism backed by scientific observations, and the opportunity to glorify British science. His book became a catalyst, transforming a pirate into a respected explorer, but the true purpose of this transformation was far deeper than mere scientific curiosity. Behind every step Dampier took, behind every new patron he gained, stood an invisible yet omnipotent antagonist, the Spanish Empire. For centuries, Spain had unilaterally controlled the immense riches of the New World, dominating trade routes and coastlines of the Pacific Ocean. Its colonies, from the Philippines to Peru, were fortresses guarding the flows of gold and silver. This monopoly, this imperial arrogance, became the primary target for Britain and, consequently, for William Dampier. His pirate raids and scientific expeditions were aimed at undermining Spanish might. Every new map, every described port, every note on the resources of the Pacific Islands became a potential weapon in London's hands against Madrid. Dampier was not merely seeking adventure, he was part of a larger geopolitical game where his unique experience was more valuable than an army. The Spanish knew Dampier as a ruthless corsair who terrorized their ships and settlements. They saw him as the embodiment of hostile British expansion, but did not suspect that his true strength lay not only in his cruelty, but also in his extraordinary intellect, used for systematic information gathering. He was not merely a raider, but a scout operating under the cover of plunder. His patrons in London effectively sponsored reconnaissance operations disguised as scientific expeditions. They provided him with ships and men so he could continue his activities under the Crown's flag, with one sole purpose: to weaken Spain's grip and open new, profitable routes for British trade and expansion. Thus, Dampier became a central figure in the shadow war of empires, where knowledge and maps were valued as much as captured gold. His story is a vivid example of how scientific inquiry could serve the most cynical imperial ambitions, and how pirate experience became a key to state service. He was the embodiment of an era where the lines between law and lawlessness, science and plunder, were blurred beyond distinction. His success in selling his story, however, masked a fundamental truth. William Dampier, a brilliant observer, was a catastrophically bad commander. The British Admiralty, charmed by his maps and promises of new lands, granted him his own ship in 1699, the HMS Roebuck, and the rank of captain in the Royal Navy. This was the apex of his ascent, the culmination of years of playing the game. The assignment was grand: to explore the coast of New Holland, present-day Australia, and find the legendary southern continent. A mission worthy of a great discoverer, it gave him carte blanche to continue his research under the protection of the Crown. But beneath the gleam of the uniform and scientific authority lay the same ruthless pragmatist, incapable of discipline or empathy. His true nature became immediately apparent. From the first days of the voyage on the Roebuck, problems began that quickly escalated into disaster. Dampier, accustomed to the anarchy of pirate crews, where authority was earned through force and fear, could not command a Royal Navy crew which required regulations and respect. He was a brilliant navigator, but a despot, not a leader. His orders were harsh, punishments unduly cruel, and his attitude toward subordinates openly contemptuous. Soon the ship became a breeding ground for discontent, hidden sabotage, and open mutiny. Officers and sailors complained of hunger, lack of provisions, and, most importantly, the unbearable tyranny of the captain. The culmination was a flagrant incident involving his first lieutenant, George Fisher. Dampier, suspecting Fisher of insubordination and a threat to his authority, ordered him shackled and, at the first opportunity, sent him home, publicly humiliating him and leaving him destitute. This was not merely a breach of regulations, it was an act of reckless rage, a manifestation of that very indifference to others' fates that he had learned in his youth, and which now cost him his reputation. The expedition, intended to bring Britain new territories and scientific discoveries, turned into a complete fiasco. The Roebuck, an old and unreliable ship, barely limped to the coast of Australia, where Dampier conducted only a superficial exploration, discovering nothing that could justify the colossal costs and risks. He sought wealth, not just scientific data, and he did not find it. On the return journey in 1701, the ship sprang a leak and rapidly sank off Ascension Island. Miraculously, the entire crew escaped death, but Dampier lost not only the ship, but also all collected samples, maps, and records, the physical embodiment of his scientific work. This was not merely a shipwreck, it was a symbolic collapse of his ambitions as an official explorer, a harbinger of his final exposure. Upon his return to England, Dampier was met not with triumph, but with a crushing court-martial. Accusations of cruelty, incompetence, and improper command poured in from all sides, but the case of Lieutenant Fisher became the central point of the indictment. The evidence was irrefutable. The court found William Dampier guilty of unfitness to command one of Her Majesty's ships and cruelty. The sentence was severe and public, striking at the very core of his meticulously constructed image. He was dismissed from the Royal Navy and deprived of all pay for the expedition. This was not just the end of his naval career, it was a public exposure that stripped the mask from the noble explorer. Society, which had recently admired his books and seen him as a hero, now faced the ugly truth. A ruthless tyrant lurked behind the facade of a scholar. His carefully built reputation crumbled overnight, transforming him from an idol into an outcast in the eyes of the establishment. His fall was swift and definitive. He never again received a command from the Crown. His name, once synonymous with adventure and discovery, was now associated with failure and cruelty. Dampier, deprived of official support, was forced to return to what he did best, private corsair raids, but no longer as an independent commander, only as an experienced pilot or navigator on others' ships. He became a shadow of himself, a man who had tricked an empire but could not trick his own nature. His last fatal mistake was that he believed his own mystification, forgetting that pirate methods and royal service were two absolutely incompatible things. The ignominious end on the Roebuck resulted for the British Crown not merely in the loss of one ship. It was a direct financial loss, amounting to thousands of pounds sterling, a colossal sum for that era, squandered with not the slightest return. The Admiralty gained neither new trade routes, nor strategic colonies, nor even reliable maps capable of undermining the Spanish monopoly in the Pacific Ocean. All of Dampier's collected samples of flora and fauna, priceless scientific data, and his unique navigational records, which could have formed the basis for future British expeditions and territorial claims, vanished without a trace into the ocean depths along with the sunken vessel. This dealt a serious blow to London's ambitions in the struggle for global dominance. The scientific community, which had expected sensational discoveries, received only fragments of information and confirmation of their recent idol's incompetence. Investors, who had previously funded his books and indirectly supported his ascent, now faced public exposure and the collapse of his reputation. Although the Roebuck was a state project, Dampier's subsequent private ventures, which he joined as a navigator, were funded by such syndicates of merchants and adventurers. These individuals, eager for quick profit, were willing to overlook his dubious past as long as his experience brought them gold. For them, the Roebuck's failure was merely an annoying setback, not negating his unique knowledge of the Pacific Ocean. He discovered neither ore nor other riches in New Holland, and his expedition brought no new resources to Britain. The Crown, in turn, was forced to admit failure and temporarily abandon plans for large-scale expansion in this region, shifting its attention to other, more promising directions. Politically, this fiasco only strengthened Spanish positions in the Pacific Ocean for decades to come. Britain lost not only a valuable ship and captain, but also precious time in the race for colonial supremacy. However, even after such public disgrace, his unique skills remained in demand in private pirate circles. He returned to his roots, becoming an indispensable pilot on ships that continued to plunder Spanish galleons and colonies. His knowledge of winds, currents, depths, and coastlines was gold for those who did not obey the crown but sought enrichment. Thus, although his official career ended in ruin, William Dampier continued to be a central figure in the shadow economy of piracy, ensuring financial success for his new, less demanding patrons. He brought no wealth to the crown but continued to bring it to others, confirming his unchanging, cynical effectiveness in a world where money ruled. The irony of William Dampier's fate lies in this: despite his official career ending in public disgrace and his last expedition turning into a complete fiasco, it was his printed word that ensured his immortality. Dampier's books, these meticulously crafted adventure reports, outlived their author and his disgrace, shaping an image that for decades overshadowed the ugly truth. He didn't just write about distant lands, he created a myth about himself, a brave explorer who accidentally found himself among pirates. This grand self-promotion, bolstered by real, albeit criminally obtained knowledge, became the foundation of his posthumous fame. The public, hungry for exoticism, and the scientific community, seeking new data, readily embraced this image, for it was far more appealing than the reality of a ruthless cutthroat. This is where the main paradox of his legacy lies. A man who used science as a cover for plunder unwittingly laid the groundwork for future geographical and biological discoveries. His accurate maps, detailed descriptions of flora and fauna, and meteorological observations, collected during pirate raids, became an invaluable resource for subsequent generations of explorers. He was not merely a pirate who could write. He was an observer whose records, though made from the basest motives, proved remarkably accurate and anticipated many scientific methods. He was, in essence, the first proto-travel blogger who understood that to sell an adventure, you must sell yourself. He didn't just share experience, he sold a vision of the world accessible only to a select few. And he did so with such conviction that his misdeeds paled before the scale of his discoveries. William Dampier's story is not merely a chronicle of adventures and downfalls. It is a poignant lesson on how easily a brilliant facade can conceal a deeply flawed essence. It shows that even the most significant discoveries can be the result not of noble aspirations, but of cold calculation and cruelty. In an era when information became the new currency, Dampier demonstrated how knowledge could be monetized, transforming it into an instrument of influence and enrichment, regardless of moral principles. Straits and islands are still named after him, and his books continue to be studied as important sources on the history of geographical discoveries. This testifies not to his virtue, but to his unprecedented mastery in creating and maintaining a self-serving narrative. William Dampier left behind not only geographical maps, but also a metaphorical map of how to manipulate public opinion and history, transforming himself from an outcast into a legend.